Welcome to Second Earth Alternative. In today's episode, I wanted to revisit Atlantis. The reason why I'm doing this episode once again is because I encountered certain evidence that I hadn't seen before, as well as logical conjectures that when I really thought about it, I realized there is no way that this island could have been in the middle of the ocean. So my goal in this episode is to intelligibly make the points of why Mauritania is the home of Atlantis, meaning Atlantis is in Africa. So I'm guessing most of the audience has already seen this, but this is what many researchers think is Atlantis. This is located in Mauritania, Africa, which is not actually that far from the coast, to be honest with you, but it is on land, which makes the whole concept of a sunken island, well, it just seems incongruous that something that is in the middle of a desert would be something that supposedly was a sunken island. But I found some really interesting evidence, as I was mentioning earlier, that kind of implies that Atlantis might have had to be close to the edge of the continent as opposed to the middle of the oceans. Okay, so just to start off, I wanted to showcase what this area would look like if it was flooded. And this is a flood map that I did in a previous episode. And as you can see, if you were to flood this entire West Sahara desert area, you would get what looks to be an island with concentric circles in the middle and a passage to the ocean, which is exactly how Atlantis was described. Now that you see that this area basically matches the description of Atlantis if it were flooded, I want to go over some of the descriptions that are written about Atlantis. So very quickly, it says here on missionatlantis.wordpress, in Plato's dialogue, Critias, he mentions that Atlantis had tall mountains, more plentiful and more impressive than any known on earth in his day. These mountains held great forests and lush meadows. Now remember this line where the article says, watered by rain in the winter. This is a point that I'm going to bring up at the end of the episode. The fertile plain was roughly 2,000 by 3,000 stades. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. A stade is roughly 1/8 of a mile. 250 by 375 miles. Plato leaves out many details. He does tell us that the plain was crossed by a network of canals bringing water to the crops grown there. Okay, so there's a lot to dissect here in terms of the description, but if we quickly check out the map of what we think is Atlantis, this entire area is actually mountains. So if we go from the center of the circle and we start exiting the circle, you see that there's all these mountainous hills all around the area. And this is actually how the mountains were described. They were not described as these like long classical peaky mountains. They were described as kind of like a plateau, like I think it was like en blanc was the word that they use. And not just that, but if you look at the mountains, they have all kinds of evidence of previous erosion. It was once lush and filled with streams and all kinds of different potential waterfalls, just water tracks all over these mountains, as you can see. And also note that the mountains are north of the circle. And this is important because that's what the description says, is that the mountains are north of the city. And there is no mountains in the south. So everything so far is matching to perfection. One other thing that the article said is that one of the lower bounds of the size of being potentially 250 miles, I mean, if we just measure it from tip to tip, we don't quite make it to 250 miles. 235 is not bad. It's pretty close. Okay, so we have this measurement, which is pretty close. But the one that really kind of startled me is on this particular article, it says that the rings in Atlantis measured 127 stades, which equals about 14.6 miles. Let's look at the size of these rings real quick. So these are the mountains. And this side, it seems like the ring starts over here. So if we go over here all the way to the end of the ring, well, we get 13.82 miles. Over here, there we go, 14.67. So as it says here, the measurement is 14.6 miles for the circle. So this is as accurate as you can get. So I want to bring up a logical conjecture, something that I didn't think about before, but when you really think about it logically, you have to almost assume that this was in Africa and not some distant island in the Atlantic Ocean. Because as it says here on Wikipedia, Afterwards, there occurred violent earthquakes and floods, and in a single day and night, misfortune, all your warlike men in a body sank into the earth, and the island of Atlantis disappeared in the depths of the sea. Okay, so it says it disappeared in the sea, but check out the next line. For which reason the sea in those parts is impassable and impenetrable, because there is a shoal of mud in the way, and this was caused by the subsidence of the island. So just think about this logically. They're saying that those parts are impenetrable and impassable because there was all this mud in the ocean. So if this was in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, one, I don't know that an island state would actually cause the Atlantic Ocean, which is pretty deep. I mean, rock sediments tend to be pretty dense compared to water. But the thing that really caught my attention is this idea that it's impassable and impenetrable, because for it to be impassable and impenetrable, that means that somebody was crossing in that pathway. And if you look at the map over here, this is what the map looked like. So this is what the known world was according to Herodotus, who happened to be one of the most accurate historians. So my point is, between West Africa and the Americas, there's no reason to sail in that direction. Who in the world would be sailing in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean if it were not the Atlanteans themselves? Wherever this area is that Atlantis sunk was somewhere where people could go and verify whether the area was impenetrable or not. So logically speaking, I'm thinking it has to be the coastal areas. That's the only areas that people were sailing back then. And one more point to consider that I never knew about this before is that according to this article, it says they also said that in these days the Atlantic was navigable, suggesting that in the days of the Egyptians it was not. So once again, we're going to use logical conjecture. This is a really interesting point, because if the Egyptians said that in the days of Atlantic it was navigable, it is directly suggesting that nowadays it's not navigable. So it would have to be some kind of landlocked situation, not something that's in the middle of the ocean. So moving on to the Herodotus map, this is really interesting because Herodotus is a very accurate ancient historian who depicted Atlantis as being in the west coast of Africa. Now, this might just be a very badly mapped out representation of Africa because so few people had actually explored all the way around Africa. In fact, there's some contention whether Nacho in 600 BC really was able to circumnavigate around the very dangerous Cape Horn area. So there is some contention as to whether this was possible or not. But the point is, if this map can be considered an accurate representation of what they thought where Atlantis was at, even though this is badly mapped, there are some very general features that we can go by, which is the direction of the continents. So we have this area formerly known as the Pillars of Hercules that connects to the Mediterranean Ocean. And we have Spain up here. And then if you just go direction-wise, let me show you on Google Earth real quick. So let's start at the Pillars of Hercules and continue going one direction until suddenly it changes. Changes right around here, the direction. So he claims that Atlantis is east of where this very tip of Africa changes. So when you take a look at Africa, you do see that the Richat Structure is basically in line to the area where it suddenly changes direction, just as you see in this map of Herodotus. So yeah, it's badly drawn, but there are some general features that seem to indicate that this might actually be Atlantis, if this description of Atlantis is accurate. So something that we brought up in a different episode that we need to consider is that the king of Atlantis was called Atlas, and the king of Mauritania, the first king of Mauritania, is also called Atlas. But there's also the metal that the Atlanteans apparently created, which was called Orichalcum. According to the Critias of Plato, 2 of the 3 outer walls of the Temple of Poseidon in Clito on Atlantis were clad respectively in brass and tin, while the third and outermost wall flashed with the red light of Orichalcum. So what is Orichalcum? Well, this is actually a little bit up to debate. Some people think it's an alloy between gold and copper, But apparently, Orichalcum was discovered on the coast of Sicily. It says here on Daily Mail, this metal found in the 2,600-year-old shipwreck proved that Atlantis did exist. Mythical red alloy said to be from the lost island is discovered off the coast of Sicily. So here are these lumps of apparent orichalcum that was discovered. And when they analyzed this lump, what they discovered is that it's mostly copper and zinc. In fact, I think it was like 80% copper and 19% zinc and a little bit of iron and nickel, apparently. Now, what's interesting is Mauritania is a very poor country, and one of its biggest exports is these mining companies that are essentially grabbing these precious metal from the ground, because it does have a lot of precious metals there. As it says here, Mauritania has rich deposits of iron ore, gold, copper, as well as phosphates and zinc. So regardless of whether you think that orichalcum is made from gold or copper, or if it's copper and zinc, it appears that Mauritania has the resources to be able to create such metals. Not just the resources, it's literally like its most valuable export, or one of the most valuable exports. Now, some people may think that this metal found in Sicily may actually indicate that Atlantis was somewhere in Sicily, which is a theory that has been suggested in the past, but I don't think this necessarily means that Atlantis was in one of those islands near Italy. Because as it says here on Wikipedia, the Atlanteans had conquered the parts of Libya within the Pillars of Hercules as far as Egypt, and the European continent as far as Tyrrhenia. So Tyrrhenia, as you see here, here's the Tyrrhenia Sea. So that's where Sicily is at. If you go a little bit south of this particular representation, it would be somewhere around here. So my point is that this could have easily been the Atlanteans conquering the area, and that's how they found the orichalcum. But there's something else to consider about that. And once again, we're going to try to extrapolate this using logic. So they say that the Atlanteans had conquered parts of Libya. Libya is up here. Pillars of Hercules, which is over here. Egypt, which is all the way back here. And the European continents, including Sicily over here. So my question is, if it was able to conquer Egypt, which is all the way in the east of Africa, why didn't they mention West Africa? They mentioned where Morocco and Spain connect. They mentioned where Italy is at. They mentioned where East Africa is at. Why would they not mention that this area may have also been conquered? Could it be that they literally come from the area? And wouldn't it make more sense that a society living 12,000 years ago would conquer this part of the region because it's its neighbors, not some distant Atlantean culture that for whatever reason decided to cross the entire ocean to conquer all these different continents? But, we can leave the Americas to the Vikings, I guess. It's just one of those things that, you can't be certain, but it just doesn't quite make sense, in my opinion. Now, this next couple points, I think, really kind of puts the nail in the coffin. So we have to consider the animals of Atlantis, because they did describe the animals that were there. As it says here, in Plato's text Critias, one finds one mention of the elephant. Critias describes the city of Atlantis. So not only did Atlantis have elephants, it apparently had bulls that were sacrificed to Poseidon. Sacred bulls were captured and sacrificed to Poseidon, from whom the kings of Atlantis descended. So the interesting thing is that Mauritania, being in Africa, used to have elephants. I think the elephants technically deserted the area in 1986. I think that's the last time they spotted elephants in Mauritania. But doesn't it make more sense to think that elephants would be in Africa as opposed to some distant island, since no elephants have ever been discovered in any island except for those dwarf elephants? And outside of the fact that Africa is the homeland of most elephants, look at this. This is a rock painting that was found not too far from the Richat Structure in Mauritania, which depicts bulls. So the cave is in this spot right over here, which is right over here, which is basically adjacent to the Richat Structure. And here is my final points, and perhaps one of the most interesting of all. Now, I mentioned in a previous episode that perhaps the Atlanteans were not Caucasian, that perhaps they were dark-skinned. And this was based on a description that I found from Plato where he described them as earth-born. But what I never seen before was this particular passage down here. Nazism and occultism. The idea that Atlanteans were Hyperborean Nordic supermen who originated in the northern Atlantic or even in the far north was popular in the German Ariosophic movements around 1900, propagated by Guido von List and others. And then it talks about another philosopher here who was the first to speak of a Nordic Atlantean or an Aryan Nordic. So I guess when I said that there was some racist undertones about the concept of Atlanteans being white, I mean, here it is. It was propagated by the Nazis. Now, the more interesting passage that I saw is the one down here where it says, the idea of Atlantis as the homeland of the Caucasian race would contradict the belief of the older esoteric and theosophic groups which taught that the Atlanteans were non-Caucasian brown-skinned peoples. So there it is, ladies and gentlemen. Basically, they're African. I mean, brown-skinned people, black people, however you want to describe it, that's Africans. It's not some Nordic race. I think the answer is a little bit more subtle. I guess what I'm trying to say is it's a more logical step to believe that this race came from this area, especially given that we have a circle, as Plato described. So I mean, when you pile all of that up, when you think about the animals, the descriptions, the measurements, the logical conjecture that somebody would have had to pass through this area at the time to be able to confirm that, yes, the water was not navigable, that it was muddy, I think this idea just becomes almost obvious at this point. But why is it that academics are having such a difficult time clinging on to the idea that this may be Atlantis? Well, it's because nobody discovered anything that would indicate that this area would magically rise. Yes, it does remain a mystery, but I should add that if you go west of the coast of Africa, you have these islands which were essentially created via volcanic activity. So this is actually a volcanic region. There's a tectonic plate that goes right around here. And actual Richat structure itself, these rings, geologists believe that this was created by the subduction and the elevation of this area due to volcanic activity. So when ancient descriptions talk about this area suddenly sinking from earthquakes, this is completely consistent with the idea that this is a unique geological feature that was created via magma chamber, some kind of dynamic that is pushing the land up and pushing it down. So yeah, we may not understand exactly why this is happening, but there is good reasons to believe that it could have happened. And something else that scientists didn't know until recently, and to me this is like, okay, this has to be Atlantis. So remember when I mentioned in the very beginning of the episode about the idea that it rained in the winters? Is a very explicit description that this is an area that would rain during the entire season? Well, check this out. So this article is talking about how Sahara Desert was once lush and populated. And this is really interesting because, as it says here, at the end of the Ice Age, the Sahara Desert was just as dry and uninviting as it is today. But sandwiched between two periods of extreme dryness were a few millennia of plentiful rainfall and lush vegetation. And so what the article is basically mentioning is that the Nile used to be the only place that humans could live in Africa, but during these few millennia, people were actually able to live in other parts of the Sahara Desert because there was this unusual monsoon that was happening. So the question is, when was this happening? But around 10,500 years ago, a sudden burst of monsoon rains over the vast desert transformed the region into habitable land. 10,500 years. That is an exact match for when Atlantis supposedly had been flourishing. Look at this. 22,000 to 10,500 years ago, not occupiable. The Sahara Desert was devoid of any human occupation. 9,000 to 7,000 years, the same thing. And so this flood that started at 10,500 years ago, I guess it lasted until about 7,000 to 5,000 years ago. So it appears that the Sahara Desert was green back when the Atlanteans supposedly were there. And look, this was done through hard science. It says, as evidenced by the researchers, 500 new radiocarbon dates of human and animal remains from more than 150 excavation sites. So it wasn't even that they think it was wet. I mean, they kind of knew that this was the case. And I just want to show you one more interesting thing about this area. So we have this evidence of a potential outcropping that could have been the actual island itself. But if you look around the area, around the island where it kind of drops off from these cliffs, you see what appears to be water markings. Look at this. This looks like ripples. Now, maybe you can argue that this was created by the wind, but there is also very distinct markings that look more like water erosion. Look at these areas that seem to kind of merge and connect and then kind of stream down this Sahara Desert. This to me looks like when a giant river kind of carves a path. And look, you can see the ripples once again. So I was taking a scenic shot of the river, and as you can see in the bottom of the shot, look at these ripples. This is what you see when water mixes with sand. And what do we got here? In my opinion, this looks almost identical. Look at this. Now, what's interesting about the ripples is if we can assume that this was created by water, it also shows the direction of the flow of water. So if this area was once underwater or partially underwater, and for whatever reason that still remains a mystery, it was eventually uplifted within 10,000 years, well, the idea of water pouring to the west completely makes sense. So like I said, I can't prove to you how all of this happened, but when you look at all the surrounding evidence, the idea that Atlanteans might have been brown people, the idea that they had elephants, the idea that this area used to be lush at the exact same time that they were there, and even maps that actually delineated Atlanteans being in this area, and you have this unique circular geological formation that you see nowhere else in the world, but somehow magically matches the description of the Atlanteans, it just seems really obvious that Atlantis was indeed in Africa. So before I finish, I just wanted to kind of give a shout out to Jimmy at Bright Insights. Even though there were other researchers that have been on this particular idea, it was his videos that actually got my attention and gave me that lightning bolt epiphany that Atlantis may have actually already been discovered. All right, for those who might be a little bit new to the channel, I do have a second channel called Strange Horizon. We have some cool UFO videos, and I will be posting another one very, very soon. So check out the channel if you enjoy it. Definitely subscribe. And if you're listening to this, well, I appreciate you sticking around till the very end. This is Felipe speaking, signing out.